John Rubino from DollarCollapse.com, and you're listening to Run to Gold.
Okay, welcome back to episode 80 of the RunToGold.com podcast. This is the third episode in this installment about tax domicile with Bill Rounds, a California attorney who helps he co-authors HowToVanish.com with me. And so welcome, Bill.
Hi, Trace.
So in our first episode in this series, we talked about tax domicile and how it's in the news. We talked about the threats that are going to be coming from municipals that have issued bonds and things, from states that are the bankrupt states, and how it's important for us to achieve tax flexibility. In the second episode, we talked about location independence and privacy, how it's a lot easier to engage in an ounce of preparation than to deal with a pound of cure, and to set up one's affairs and order them in a way that they can quickly and easily cut those junction points with the different municipal or state governments that pose a threat to their wealth. And so in this third episode, we're going to be talking about the overall strategy of tax domicile. So, Bill, what exactly is this tax domicile, and how does it relate to U.S. citizens and also to just citizens of most countries in the world?
Okay, well, as far as U.S. citizens are concerned, all U.S. citizens have one state that is considered their tax domicile, like their tax home. That doesn't matter whether you spend 11 of the 12 months of the year traveling the world. It doesn't matter whether you spend your entire time inside of one state. Everyone has one state that is their tax domicile and one state only. Now, this also applies to citizens around the world where you're thinking about the different provinces or regions of the different countries. Canada, Australia are a couple that I can think of right off the top of my head, where different provinces or regions will have different tax rates depending on what province, region, or state you're living in. The U.S. isn't the only country that does that.
In fact, the U.S., the federal government taxes people on their worldwide income. Unlike most governments like those in Europe or Asia, for example, they only tax their residents and not necessarily their citizens. So, for example, if you're a German or a Brit, but you're resident in Hong Kong, then Hong Kong's going to tax you. But you don't have to necessarily pay your taxes back to the UK or to Germany. So when the principles are pretty much the same, though. Wouldn't you agree?
Right.
So whether you're a Brit trying to establish tax domicile in Hong Kong, or whether you're a Californian who wants to become a Nevadan, the principles and the strategies for establishing that tax domicile are pretty much the same. And so that leads us to the issue, well, how is a tax domicile determined?
Okay, now every state in the U.S. and throughout the world, every jurisdiction is going to have a slightly different way of doing it, but they all follow pretty much the same idea. And that idea is they look for the state that you have the closest connections to. And generally, it's a fairly simple process that they go through. They go through all of the connections that they can find that a person has to a certain state and all of the states, and they just do a balancing test. They logically look at the connections, which connections are more weighty, which connections are less weighty, and some are stronger and some are weaker than others, and they simply weigh in their kind of logical assessment what state you have the closest connections to. Now obviously their logical assessment is slightly biased because states want to have a person domiciled in their state for tax purposes because they get the tax revenue. But you also have to consider that each state is going to be kind of vying against another because only one state can have the tax domicile at a time.
Yeah, and we should also note that your place of residence also factors into estate taxes.
Right.
Which can be a significant concern to some people. So when we're looking at these closest connections, obviously some factors weigh heavier and some factors weigh less than others. For example, if you have a quote-unquote home and utility bills and things of that nature, that might weigh a lot heavier than where you have, for instance, country club membership. Right.
Right. There's, in every state is slightly different, but things that might logically establish a firmer connection, like you said, a home, would be pretty weighty. Where you own a business may or may not be weighty, depending on whether you have businesses in other states, where your business actually operates. For example, if your business is an internet business, that really has no particular location. But if your business is a mine, that has a particular location, and so that's going to be a little bit more weighty.
Yeah, and so in this tax domicile report, it's 55 pages. I mean, this is almost absurd that there are these many things that matter. Because when I remember when we were first researching this, we found a lot of articles on the internet where they're like, oh, well, move your home and move your voter registration and move your driver's license and all these other lists of things. And yes, they're important to do, but that's not necessarily the whole picture, is it?
No, it's not. It's actually quite far from the entire picture.
And these are articles by other attorneys.
Certainly, they're good. They have good information, but they're a general overview, usually one page, maybe two, if you printed them out on the internet, off of the internet. But there are a lot more connections, and there's a lot more that goes into determining what your closest connection is. Because even if you have maybe one or two strong connections to a state, if all of your other connections are to another particular state, that may be able to balance out even owning a home, a large home in one state. And
so it's going to be if you know all the different factors that go into the equation, you could say, that are found in this 55-page tax domicile report, then you're able to employ a strategy in conjunction with just general privacy principles in your life to really make certain connections disappear while at the same time perhaps making other connections appear, or at least appear more prominently, right? And what would be an example of being able to do that?
Right, because at the same time that you are preventing problems from frivolous lawsuits or harassment or extortion, things like that from criminals, you're going to be doing things that removes a lot of the information about your connections from the public domain. So they're going to be things that that aren't really known to anybody except yourselves and the private individuals that you share it with. So one example would be ownership of your home. There are several legal tools that you can use, for example, using an LLC or a trust or something like that, to own a piece of property without having your name associated with it in any way. Now, that keeps a lot of potential frivolous litigators from looking you up and seeing what kind of assets you own. But it also makes your connection to the state where you own that property a lot less prominent. Although if they ask you, of course, you're the beneficial owner of a home there, but the chances of them actually finding that and asking you are much, much lower when you own a home in an LLC or a trust.
Yeah, because, keep in mind, the state is going through their own cost-benefit analysis of whether this cow that they're trying to milk is worth the effort to go through and catch it and milk it. So if you, for example, we were meeting with a reader today, and I brought up that you can form a New Mexico LLC, and you can have a registered agent, and the actual managers and members of the LLC don't appear in the public record, right? And so if instead of having a home in your own name, you have a home in the name of this LLC, and then perhaps you have another LLC that rents a home in yet a second state. Well, now you're able to have different connections appear and different connections not appear in the public record, which makes it a little bit more difficult to acquire all of the facts to decide whether or not to challenge what someone asserts to be their tax domicile.
Right. I've heard you talk about it before when we were discussing these kinds of things. It's almost like, a herd of wildebeest in Africa trying to cross a river. And there's alligators in the water. The alligators are like the taxing authorities. And they are going after the people who don't do it right, who don't change their domicile correctly. They're going to be picking off some of the wildebeest out of that herd. But doing it correctly, if you use a lot of these tools, it's almost like a bridge over the river. You don't even have to get in the water. Those alligators are not going to go after a wildebeest that's crossing over a bridge because it has no chance.
Yeah, so when we look at, say, New Jersey, for example, we mentioned them earlier. Last year they had $70 billion in net worth leave the state, change their tax domicile. Obviously, they can't go after everyone. So who are they going to go after? Well, they're going to go after the wildebeest that's in the water, that's easiest to find, not the wildebeest who is crossing over the bridge. And remember, we're looking at this from what is legal. I mean, we're looking at all the tests and just taking the preemptive steps to do it the right way,
right, because
preemptively.
Right, because when you control these connections that you have, you're able to actually establish real connections in the state that you choose. You're able to weaken the connections in the states which have higher state income tax that you don't want. And using an LLC is one of those ways. You still have the connection. It's just a much weaker connection. And so when you put that into the balancing scales, it's much weaker than it would have been had you owned that property in your own name.
Yeah, so I remember one of our professors in law school, he said, which would you rather control, the law or the facts? And the truth of the matter is, if you can control the facts, you control the outcome of the case. I mean, when you're, remember the last case you were litigating, if only you could have gone back in time and told your client to do one or two things differently, it would have made a large difference in the outcome of the case. In fact, he probably wouldn't have even been in court.
There would not have been a case.
There would not have been a case.
One, maybe two facts.
Yeah, which could have been done actually pretty easily and done preemptively. So that ounce of prevention could definitely be worth a pound of cure. And so that's really what this tax domicile is all about, being able to preemptively go through, change the facts that you need to change, exactly how they need to be changed, to make it difficult for them to even target you as a potential person to challenge your tax domicile. And even if they do challenge your tax domicile, they'll 99% chance they'll lose.
Right. It shows you the facts that are relevant. It shows you what you can do to control those facts so that they're in your favor.
Yeah. So this has been episode 80 of the RunToGold.com podcast. And in our next episode, we're going to give you a couple helpful tips regarding your residential address. As we've talked about, the tax domicile report is available at taxdomicile.howtovanish.com, and obviously we can't go through strategies and tactics for everything in it because it's a huge 55-page report consisting mostly of all the legal research and things of that nature. But we're going to have one or two extremely helpful tips in the next podcast.
This is Tom DiLorenzo from the Mises Institute, and you're listening to Run to Gold.